I hadn't seen my family in over a decade. The last time I stood in front of them, I was dripping wet from the rain, holding nothing but a suitcase and their silence. They told me I wasn't good enough, not pretty enough, not smart enough, that I wasn't their kind of daughter. So I left. No degree, no money, no home. Just the kind of pain that either breaks you or makes you unstoppable. 11 years later, I stepped into my sister's wedding looking nothing like the girl they threw out. Designer dress, head held high. Beside me, my husband, one of the top cardiothoracic surgeons in the state, and our son with his father's brilliant eyes and my quiet fire. I wasn't invited, but I didn't need an invitation to walk into a room I helped them build. What happened next stopped the entire ballroom. The bride froze. My parents paled. And the groom, he asked, "Do you know her?" And I said, "More than you think. This isn't just a story about revenge. It's about reclaiming your name, your dignity, and your power. Stay with me because by the end of this story, you won't just be cheering for me, you'll be questioning everything you believe about family loyalty and what it really means to win." Ready? Let's begin. My name is Claire Dawson. I'm 43 years old, a self-made woman, and the co-founder and CEO of one of the fastest-growing medical technology companies in the Midwest. I wasn't always in this position, not by a long shot, but that part of my life isn't for now. Today, I'm not a CEO or an industry speaker or anyone of note. Today, I am a guest, an unexpected one, at a wedding held in the most opulent ballroom I've ever stepped into. As I enter Greenwood Estate with my husband, Dr. Samuel Lewis, and our 6-year-old son, Henry, I'm immediately struck by the sheer extravagance. The chandeliers above us shimmer like falling stars, casting light across the white marble floors and golden-trimmed arches. Waiters glide between clusters of guests holding silver trays aloft, and the smell of orchids lingers in the air, fresh, expensive, and artificial. Every detail screams wealth and legacy, and yet somehow it feels hollow. Sam's hand rests at the small of my back. It's his silent way of anchoring me, knowing how easily a place like this could reopen old wounds. Henry tugs at my other hand, already fidgeting in his suit, whispering that his tie is too tight. I crouch down, adjusting it for him with a soft smile, whispering a promise about the pool later, and he nods with exaggerated seriousness. I straighten up, take a breath, and step further into the crowd, not knowing that I'm about to come face to face with a ghost I wasn't expecting. We weren't exactly sure who was getting married when the invitation came. The name Robert Hale sounded familiar. He's a cardiovascular surgeon I'd met briefly at a medical conference 2 years ago, a rising figure in clinical innovation circles. His note had mentioned wanting to reconnect and extend a formal invitation to celebrate a new chapter in his life. Sam had insisted we attend. It felt polite, professional. We thought it would be a weekend escape, just a brief appearance, a toast, and then time by the pool with Henry. But as the music swells and the crowd parts slightly around the long aisle, my breath catches in my throat. The bride, elegant, glowing, and dressed in white, is someone I haven't seen in over a decade. My sister, Emily Dawson. Her face is older, more polished, with expertly done makeup and a practiced smile that she probably learned from our mother. But the tilt of her head, the slight narrowing of her eyes when she laughs, those haven't changed. I'm frozen for a moment, not by fear or nerves, but by the sheer weight of surprise. Emily standing beneath a floral arch about to marry Robert Hale. And Robert looking calm, composed, completely unaware that the woman he invited to this wedding is the estranged sister of his bride. Emily turns slightly, catching sight of me. Her body stiffens as her eyes lock with mine across the room. The champagne flute in her hand trembles just enough to notice if you're looking for it. I'm looking for it. Her carefully built mask doesn't slip, not entirely, but the crack is there. It's a moment suspended in time, one I know she hadn't prepared for. From her expression alone, I can tell she thought she was safe, that 11 years was long enough to erase me, to wipe me from the Dawson family history like a smudge on a mirror. But ghosts don't disappear. Sometimes they walk in through the front door wearing heels and a Valentino dress. I don't move toward her. I don't raise my glass or smile. I simply hold her gaze as the music continues and the conversations resume around us. But within our circle, hers and mine, everything has fallen silent. A hand brushes my arm. It's Robert, the groom, moving through the crowd to greet guests. His eyes light up with recognition. "Claire Dawson," he says, offering his hand with warm surprise. "I didn't realize you'd actually be able to come. It's a real honor." Before I can respond, his eyes flicker to Emily, whose complexion has gone a shade paler. Something clicks. Slowly he turns to her and says, "You know her." The pause that follows isn't long, but it stretches like glass about to break. All eyes nearby shift between us. Emily opens her mouth perhaps to answer, but I beat her to it. I give Robert a measured smile. "More than you think." The words hang in the air like perfume, elegant, controlled, and potent. Robert looks between us, sensing the sudden undercurrent, but unable to place it. Emily tries to speak, but her voice catches for just a second, just long enough for him to notice, just long enough for the curiosity to spark in his mind. And in that moment, I know something Emily hasn't figured out yet. The story she's been telling, the truth she's spent years burying, is about to start unraveling thread by delicate thread. And I'm not even trying. I'm just standing here. Because sometimes showing up is the most powerful thing you can do. The moment I locked eyes with Emily across the ballroom, something long buried stirred inside me. Not anger, not even grief, just memory. Heavy, relentless memory. I stood there composed on the outside, but inside a tide was rising. It carried me back to a different life. A smaller life. A colder one. One where I wasn't Claire Dawson, CEO. I was just Claire, the daughter who didn't obey the girl who disappeared. I was 19 when the conversation happened. It wasn't loud. No shouting, no slammed doors. Just my father, Dr. Richard Dawson, sitting behind his oak desk in the home office, flanked by a wall of medical diplomas and family photos. He leaned back in his chair, folding his hands as if presenting a clinical diagnosis. "You're not thinking clearly," he said, calm and calculated. "The clinic needs you. That's what's best for the family." My mother, Margaret, stood behind him, arms crossed, nodding like a courtroom spectator whose verdict had already been written. But I had a different path in mind. I wanted to study health systems management, not medicine. I didn't want to inherit their practice, much less work there under a microscope of judgment. I told them so with quiet honesty. My father didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. "If you're too ungrateful to help the people who raised you," he said, standing now towering over me, "then don't bother coming back." Those words landed like iron. No negotiation. No space to disagree. And when I asked with trembling restraint how I was supposed to pay for school if they cut me off, they exchanged a glance so quick and deliberate I almost missed it. "You have options," my mother said. "But since you won't support us, we won't support you." I was still trying to understand what they meant when I found out just a week later that my college fund money saved in my name since I was a child had been withdrawn and transferred to another account. An account linked to Emily's upcoming semester at Stanford. She was 2 years younger than me, freshly accepted and full of the ambitions they approved of. They didn't even lie about it. Margaret just said, "It's going to the daughter who actually wants to contribute." From there, everything moved fast. One night I came home from a late shift at the local diner to find my belongings packed. A single suitcase sat by the front door. No note, no warning, just quiet eviction. Emily stood nearby, arms folded. She didn't speak either. She didn't have to. I left without protest. I didn't scream or cry. I remember it rained that night, not in some poetic, movie-perfect way, but in sheets that soaked my shoes and blurred my vision. I remember standing at the bus stop, clutching my suitcase, realizing that I had nowhere to go that night except a friend's couch. I slept there for 2 months. The couch was lumpy and too short. Her apartment was noisy and the refrigerator barely worked. But it was a roof. I paid rent by cleaning and cooking, and when I wasn't doing that, I worked at a coffee shop at dawn, then answered phones at a hospital reception desk until 9 at night. On weekends, I sat in a call center trying to sell insurance policies I couldn't afford myself. I didn't talk to my parents again, not because I didn't want to, but because I didn't know how. The shame was suffocating. I wasn't the rebel they painted me as. I didn't drop out because I couldn't hack it. I dropped out because they made sure there was no path forward. Still, somewhere deep inside me, I believed maybe, just maybe, they'd change. That if I showed humility, if I made the first move, things could be different. So I wrote a letter. Not an email. A real letter in my careful handwriting on stationery I bought with tips. I told them I was sorry for how things ended. That I missed them. That I still wanted to come home for the holidays if they'd have me. I didn't ask for money. Just a chance. I addressed it to our old house. I even walked it to the mailbox myself, fingers trembling as I let it go. Weeks passed, then months. No reply ever came. It would take years for me to understand that the silence wasn't forgetfulness, it was intentional. They hadn't lost my letter. They had simply chosen not to answer. And now, 11 years later, I stood in the center of their world again. I was the woman they had erased, the name they'd scrubbed from family photos and holiday cards. But I was still here, breathing, building, thriving. They had rewritten the family story without me, but I had written a story of my own. I looked across the room at Emily, still reeling, still trying to mask the fear behind her smile. And in that moment, I knew one thing without doubt: I had never truly left. They had tried to delete me, but I had always existed just outside the margins of their comfort, waiting for the day I would no longer need their permission to be real. I hadn't expected my life to turn upward from a broken foundation, but looking back now, perhaps it was never about what I expected. It was about what I chose to do with what remained. After leaving home with nothing but a suitcase and a half-empty heart, I knew I couldn't afford to let bitterness root itself too deeply. I needed something practical, something possible. So I enrolled at a community college 2 bus rides from the apartment I shared with a friend of a friend. It wasn't glamorous, and it certainly wasn't where I thought my future would begin, but it was enough. The classrooms were small, the chairs squeaked, and the fluorescent lights buzzed relentlessly overhead. Most days I arrived tired from my early shift at the coffee shop. I studied during my 15-minute breaks, scribbling on napkins when I couldn't afford notebooks. I took night classes when I could, and every semester I inched forward. Slowly, quietly, unseen by anyone who had once claimed to know me. After 2 years of relentless juggling work, study, rent, I earned enough credits and transferred to a state university. The day my acceptance email came, I cried alone in the back room of the hospital where I worked part-time just behind the reception desk. Not because it was prestigious. It wasn't. But because it was mine. Paid for by my own exhaustion and determination. That was where I met Sam Lewis. At the time, he was just a surgical resident, bleary-eyed like everyone else in the night shifts. He came to the front desk more often than necessary, always asking about patient files, though later I realized he just wanted an excuse to linger. One evening, during a particularly slow shift, he noticed the binder I had open beside me, not gossip magazines like most assumed I'd be reading, but diagrams and notes on patient monitoring systems. I was working on a term paper about post-operative care efficiency. He looked at it, then at me, and said, "You understand this?" I didn't answer right away. Most people didn't expect me to. But then I nodded. "It's not the sensors," I said, "it's the handoff between departments. That's where the breakdown happens." He pulled up a chair and asked questions. For the next 45 minutes we debated, explored, and critiqued current systems in a way I hadn't done with anyone before. It became a pattern. He'd show up with a coffee and a challenge. How would you streamline ICU alerts without increasing nurse load? Where's the gap in tracking post-op complications over weekends? It was never condescending, never performative. Just 2 people curious about the same problem from different angles. Eventually he said it aloud. "You know this. This could actually be something. A system. Not just an academic paper. And I laughed. Not because it was funny, but because no one had ever looked at me like a peer before. We started small. A Google Doc shared between shifts. Then weekend meetings in his cramped studio apartment with a whiteboard propped against a closet door. I brought the ideas. He brought the clinical experience. Together, we built a prototype. It was rudimentary at first, full of glitches and placeholder code, but it worked enough to catch the attention of a small rural hospital that let us run a pilot in a post-surgical unit. We called it Medscope. It wasn't just software. It was a way to reduce human error to flag complications before they became crises, to track subtle changes in vitals across departments in real time. It didn't replace people, it helped them. Nurses loved it. Surgeons started asking questions. And eventually, word began to spread. For the first 2 years, we operated out of our apartment. Our office was a kitchen table stacked with folders, laptops, and coffee-stained printouts. I still worked weekends at the hospital, and Sam juggled surgeries with meetings. We had no funding, no press, and no formal investors. But we had something better. Results. When a second hospital saw their post-op readmissions drop by 15%, they invited us to present our findings at a regional medical summit. I'd never spoken in front of more than a classroom before, but I stood on that stage, heart pounding, and told them what we'd done, why it worked, and how it could change the standard of care. They listened. After that, we got invited again, and again. Suddenly, I wasn't the girl who'd once been told she'd thrown her future away. I was the woman asked to present at national conferences. I sat on panels beside people who used to sign my paychecks. One of them once asked where I trained. I smiled and said I didn't. I built. But even as Medscope began to grow beyond our kitchen table, I never forgot what it took to get there. I remembered every night I fell asleep on a borrowed couch, every shift that ended in aching feet, every rejection that hardened into resolve. My path hadn't been paved, it had been clawed out of brick. Still, I didn't share much of it. Not publicly, not professionally, not even with Sam until long after we were already building a life together. It felt too raw, too heavy, and honestly unnecessary. Because what mattered wasn't where I'd been. It was where I was going. I thought I had put the past behind me. I thought I was done with the name Dawson and everything it carried. But then came the invitation from Dr. Robert Hale and the quiet promise of a wedding weekend far from my memories. Just a quick trip. Just a formal event. Nothing more. I should have known better. Because sometimes the road you think you've left behind is still waiting for you, paved with silence and unfinished business. And whether you walk it or not, it has a way of finding you again. The ballroom had not changed much from when I entered it the first time, still echoing with music, still adorned with crystal chandeliers and delicate white roses. But the air had shifted. I could feel it. Not just because the champagne in my glass had grown warm, or because the string quartet had paused between songs. No, the difference was subtler, heavier. It was the weight of recognition. As I stood near the refreshment table, smiling politely as my son Henry tugged at his bow tie, I became aware of the glances. First one, then another. A doctor with a silver name tag from Johns Hopkins leaned toward her companion. Her whisper was faint, but I caught the words, "Isn't that Claire Dawson?" "No, Claire Lewis now, from Medscope." A younger nurse, barely out of residency by the look of her, blinked at me, then reached for her phone with the urgency of someone needing to confirm a suspicion. Sam, ever steady beside me, rested his hand gently on the small of my back, just as he always had when the world began to shift under my feet. I glanced at him and he offered a quiet nod. We had expected this. We hadn't expected the bride to be my sister, no, but the rest of it. The slow turning of heads, the whispers growing louder with every passing minute. This was familiar terrain. "Is that the woman from the summit in Boston?" I heard someone murmur. "She built that monitoring system, what's it called? Medscope. It cut our post-op complications by a third. The names, the figures, the credentials, they came not from me but from the crowd. They did the work for me. I had no need to announce myself. I was already known and, more importantly, respected." But across the room, standing rigid with her hand clutching a champagne flute too tightly, Emily wasn't adjusting as smoothly. I saw her smile falter when Rob leaned toward her, whispering something in her ear. Her eyes darted quickly toward me, toward Sam, and then toward our son, who had just discovered the chocolate-covered strawberries at the dessert table. Her lips tightened, her shoulders rose. I could tell she was trying to keep the moment under control, trying to pretend the woman standing in the heart of her wedding celebration was not the very sister she'd long denied. But Rob wasn't buying it. He took a few casual steps forward, leaving Emily speaking with one of the hospital directors. Then a few more. His pace slowed as he approached, his eyes searching mine not with anger or even suspicion, but curiosity. "I feel like I've seen you before," he said. His tone was friendly, but wary. "Do you work in healthcare?" Before I could answer, another voice cut through the hum of conversation behind us. I recognized it instantly. Smooth, authoritative, and low with tension. "What are you doing here?" I turned. My father stood just a few feet away. His suit fit as impeccably as ever, his tie perfectly knotted. But his face, his face had aged more than I expected. There were creases around his mouth that hadn't been there before, and a faint paleness beneath his eyes that no concealer could hide. Margaret appeared beside him a moment later, her mouth already forming the familiar disapproving line I remembered so well. "I'm attending a wedding," I said simply. "This is family," my mother snapped. "This is not your place." "Margaret." Sam stepped slightly forward, his tone still calm. "Claire was invited." "By who?" Richard demanded, his gaze now narrowing on Sam, then drifting to our son. "By the groom," I answered, turning my attention back to Rob. Dr. Robert Hale extended the invitation. I had no idea at the time that he was marrying Emily Dawson. Rob's eyebrows lifted. His confusion was palpable. "You two are sisters," I said before Emily could rush over and intercept. "At least by blood." Emily finally reached us, flustered and breathless, as though she'd been sprinting to catch a train already in motion. "She wasn't supposed to come," she told Rob in a rushed whisper. "It's a misunderstanding." "I was invited," I said again, my voice steady, my posture unyielding. "I have the email confirmation if you'd like to see it." The statement wasn't a threat, it was a boundary. A clear, irrefutable line that none of them could cross, no matter how many years they had spent rewriting my absence as failure. Around us, guests were watching now. Not obviously, but with that particular quiet of people sensing a deeper story beneath polite surface. "She shouldn't be here," my father repeated more softly this time, as if trying to reassert control. "This is Emily's day." But Rob wasn't listening to Richard. His attention was fixed on me, and then on Sam, and finally on Henry, who had wandered back over with a chocolate-streaked smile. "You're Claire Dawson," he said slowly. "Medscope. You were the keynote in Chicago, weren't you?" "I was," I replied. Emily reached for his arm. "It's not what you think." Rob turned to her, brows furrowed. "I'm starting to think I don't know what to think." I didn't need to say more. I had no intention of stealing attention or creating drama. But standing there surrounded by people who once erased me, I realized something deeper had shifted. I wasn't the forgotten daughter anymore. I was the woman no one could afford to ignore. The room had started to adjust to my presence, at least on the surface. Conversations resumed, waitstaff moved through with trays of hors d'oeuvres, and the string quartet began another softly lilting melody. But beneath the polished calm, I could feel the tension building, curling like steam under a sealed lid. Rob hadn't taken his eyes off me since our brief exchange. Not with suspicion, not with accusation, but with something deeper, curiosity maybe, or the early flickers of realization. Emily, ever the practiced hostess, floated between groups of guests, her smile carefully pasted on her hands, fluttering with purpose. Yet every few minutes her eyes would dart in my direction, checking to see if I was still there. If I had decided to make a scene. I hadn't. I didn't need to. My presence alone was enough. I sipped my champagne standing beside Sam and chatting lightly with a hospital administrator from Boston who had approached to compliment our latest Medscope rollout. As we spoke, I noticed Rob making his way across the ballroom toward a table of physicians. He leaned in, exchanging a few quiet words. A moment later, he gestured for Emily to join him. She hesitated, then smiled too widely and stepped into the group of doctors. One of them, a broad-shouldered man with a gentle Midwestern drawl, said something I didn't catch. But I saw Emily's expression shift slightly. Her smile twitched. The doctor continued, evidently asking about her experience managing the family clinic. "Oh yes," Emily replied quickly, voice confident. "We've implemented platelet-rich plasma therapies as part of our post-op protocols. It's been remarkably effective, especially with joint procedures." I nearly choked on my drink. The doctor paused, tilted his head. "Interesting," he said politely. "I thought Stanford's med school pivoted away from that practice about 3 years ago. Have they revisited it?" Emily blinked. "Well, you know how academic trends cycle," she said with a little laugh. "Some programs cling to the classics longer than others." The doctor's eyes narrowed slightly, though he didn't press. Rob, however, was watching intently. "Remind me," he asked gently, "you graduated in what year?" Emily hesitated. It was mostly online, a kind of hybrid, accelerated program they offered back then. Sam shifted beside me. His hand found mine, a silent reassurance that no, I wasn't imagining any of this. "Stanford doesn't do hybrid medical degrees," Rob said slowly. "They never have." A brief silence fell over the group. Emily's smile held, but barely. "Well, it wasn't the main medical program," she added quickly. "It was a specialized track. Very exclusive." The group didn't respond. The polite veneer remained, but there was a sudden chill in the air, one I knew too well. That moment when people start to doubt what they've been told. I didn't say a word. I didn't need to. I simply turned back to the conversation with the hospital administrator, letting my laughter drift across the room like a breeze. Emily could feel it. She didn't have to look. Rob's gaze returned to me once more, then back to Emily. "Did you say you studied under Dr. Kellerman?" he asked. "Yes," she replied too quickly. He nodded slowly. "Odd. He retired the year before you would have enrolled." Emily's hand trembled slightly as she reached for her champagne glass. That's when Henry wandered over. In his small hand was a chocolate truffle, and on his face was a thoughtful expression that only a 6-year-old could pull off with such innocent precision. "Mom," he said, tugging gently at the hem of my dress. "Is that the lady you showed me in the picture with the red buildings? The one you said went to Stanford like you?" I froze. The group did too. A breathless silence stretched between all of us. Rob turned slowly. "You went to Stanford?" "No," I said calmly, still looking at Henry. "Remember, buddy? I went to State." He furrowed his brow. But the red buildings, that was her spring break trip, the one I couldn't afford. Rob's face changed then. Not dramatically, not all at once, but something in his eyes sharpened, focused, and then grew distant. I saw the flash of doubt harden into something more serious. Emily tried to speak, but her voice cracked just slightly. "Kids mix things up," she said, her tone now brittle. "They don't always remember details correctly." But no one was looking at Henry. They were looking at her. And in that moment, surrounded by her new in-laws, her respected colleagues, and a husband beginning to connect the dots, Emily was no longer the carefully curated center of attention. She was a story unraveling in real time. And I was just the ghost she'd tried to bury, standing quietly at the edge of the spotlight, letting the truth speak for itself. The wedding was winding down. The soft clinking of glasses had given way to the occasional pop of heels on marble as guests began filtering out their laughter, trailing behind them like perfume. Claire stood near the coat check, adjusting Henry's small blazer, while Sam made polite goodbyes to a cluster of surgeons discussing Medscope's latest trial outcomes. She didn't notice Rob until he cleared his throat softly. He stood alone now, no Emily on his arm, no champagne in his hand. His tie was slightly loosened, his expression unreadable. "Claire," he said, voice low and steady. "Do you have a minute?" She nodded, keeping her voice even. "Of course." He motioned toward the hallway just off the ballroom. They walked in silence for a few steps until they reached a quiet corner near a large window. Outside, the estate's manicured garden glowed under fairy lights, deceptively peaceful. "I didn't want to ask this in front of everyone," Rob began. "But I need to know the truth." Claire didn't answer immediately. She looked at the garden, her reflection in the glass beside his. "I didn't come here to cause problems," she finally said. "You invited me. I had no idea Emily was the bride." "I believe you," Rob said. "That's not what I'm asking." He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out his phone, swiping quickly until he landed on a file. Then he turned the screen toward her. Claire leaned in, her breath catching. It was a medical chart dated nearly 12 years ago. The patient name was hers. Claire Dawson. The details were vague, a follow-up on a procedure, never completed notes from a physician she didn't recognize, and a billing code for a treatment she never received. "I found this in the system," Rob said. "I've been auditing older files ever since I got involved with the Dawson clinic. Something about the numbers never sat right." Claire stared at the screen, her throat tightening. This isn't mine. I've never been treated at the clinic. Not for this." "I know," Rob said quietly. "That's what worried me." She looked at him, the pieces beginning to fall into place like a jigsaw puzzle long buried in dust. Her name hadn't just disappeared from the family clinic system, it had been repurposed. "I thought they just deleted my records after I left," Claire said slowly. "That was bad enough. I didn't know they used me to cover their tracks." Rob hesitated. "It wasn't just your records. I've found several anomalies, duplicate patient names, suspicious billing patterns, ghost treatments. But yours was the earliest, and the only one tied to a family member." Claire felt a chill bloom in her chest. "They were setting me up. In case the fraud was ever discovered, it would look like I was involved." "They knew you were leaving," Rob said. "That you had no resources, no support. You wouldn't fight back because you couldn't afford to. And if an investigation ever came well, you were the black sheep, the dropout, easy to blame." Claire exhaled slowly, her hands clenched at her sides. "When I confronted them about the tuition money, they told me I wasn't Stanford material, that I was ungrateful. I thought that was the end of it. It wasn't," Rob said. "Claire, they didn't just throw you out. They erased you and then used your name to build a wall of protection around themselves." Her voice turned bitter. "A scapegoat." He nodded. "I think so." Claire turned back to the window. Outside, Henry ran across the lawn, chasing a floating lantern, Sam just a few steps behind. The sight grounded her. "I've spent years building something real," she said. "Something with integrity. While they—" She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. Rob was silent for a moment. Then he said, "I'm sorry. I didn't know what I was marrying into." "You couldn't have," she said. "They're very good at pretending." He looked down at the phone still in his hand. "I'm going to dig deeper. If there's more, I'll find it." Claire gave a small, tired nod. "Do what you have to do." He hesitated, then added, "You've already been punished once for their choices. I won't let it happen again." Claire met his eyes. In them she saw something unexpected, not just remorse, but resolve. A man who had just realized the family he married into might not only be built on lies, but on calculated betrayal. And she, once cast out as unworthy, was the only one who had ever told the truth. The quiet between Claire and Rob lingered after their exchange, heavy with unspoken truths. As Rob slipped away to rejoin the wedding party, Claire remained near the arched hallway, trying to calm the storm gathering in her chest. She had come to this wedding thinking it would be her sister's big day, but everything was unraveling fast, and not in the way she expected. A familiar laugh echoed from the ballroom, a high-polished sound that never quite reached the eyes. Claire turned and caught sight of Emily beaming with rehearsed warmth as she addressed a group of guests. Her hands gestured gracefully, her smile wide, and yet something was off. Then came the moment that pulled everything into sharp focus. "Ladies and gentlemen," Emily announced from the center of the floor, clinking a glass with precise confidence. "Please raise your glasses for my mother, the beautiful bride, tonight." A pause stretched unnaturally long. Claire blinked. The beautiful bride. Her mother gasps rippled softly across the room. Claire stepped forward, eyes scanning the front of the crowd. There beside Emily stood Margaret Dawson, not dressed as the matron of the family, but in an elegant ivory gown with a bouquet in hand, and Rob's arm looped through hers. Claire's breath caught in her throat. Her heart dropped. It wasn't Emily getting married tonight. It was Margaret, her own mother. A few guests applauded in confusion. Some laughed, thinking it was a joke or a second surprise ceremony. But Claire knew better. This wasn't sentimental. This was calculated. Rob's earlier discomfort now made perfect sense. Emily stepped forward again, smiling like a pageant winner. "My mother has spent her life healing others through our family clinic. Today she begins a new chapter, not just as a physician, but as the wife of a man whose work has changed lives. Please welcome Dr. and Mrs. Robert Hale." Claire could feel the eyes of a dozen doctors around her shifting toward her. The guests who recognized her from Medscope. The realization hit like a freight train. They weren't just marrying for love, if love had anything to do with it at all. They were consolidating influence. Power. She remembered how Rob had asked about Medscope, about future hospital contracts, about predictive systems and data integrity. He had seemed curious, genuinely impressed. Now she knew why. Claire wasn't just a guest at this wedding. She was a target. This was about legitimacy, about laundering the clinic's reputation through a respectable man like Rob, and perhaps even more chillingly, about inching their way closer to Claire's company through him. She stepped back away from the soft glow of celebration fury quietly building behind her composed exterior. It wasn't enough for them to erase her. Now they were trying to rewrite their own narrative without her, but using her world to do it. She thought of the medical chart Rob had shown her just moments before. Her name used like a pawn. This wedding wasn't about family or healing old wounds. It was a smokescreen. Claire moved toward Sam, who was now holding Henry near the dessert table. He looked up when he saw her approaching and read her expression immediately. "What is it?" he asked quietly. She whispered close to his ear. "It's not Emily's wedding." He raised an eyebrow. "It's my mother's. To Rob." His jaw tightened. "Emily played the part of bride all day," Claire continued. But she was covering for Margaret, selling the illusion just long enough to secure the right eyes and ears in the room. "Eyes like ours?" Sam asked. Claire nodded. "Exactly." Sam's gaze shifted across the ballroom. "Then that means this was never about love. It was about protecting the practice, about keeping Rob close, and keeping us closer." Claire turned her eyes back toward the head table. Margaret now sat beside Rob, her ivory gown radiant under the chandeliers, her smile brittle. But something in her posture betrayed the truth, an urgency, a quiet desperation like a woman trying to patch a sinking ship before anyone notices the water at her feet. Claire's jaw tightened. For years they had painted her as the irresponsible one, the disgrace, the burden. But in truth, the family's survival had never depended on her compliance. It had depended on her silence. And now she wasn't silent anymore. Claire kept her distance for the rest of the reception, staying close to Sam and Henry. The earlier revelation about her mother's marriage to Rob still echoed in her mind like a dissonant chord. It changed everything. What she once thought was a wedding for her sister had revealed itself to be a meticulously calculated alliance, and now Claire understood the stakes. But she wasn't prepared for what came next, a different kind of betrayal. One that didn't target her, but the person she held dearest. Henry had wandered to the edge of the ballroom, curious as ever, drawn by the chocolate fountain and the row of intricate desserts lined up on silver platters. Claire was speaking with a hospital director when she noticed Emily kneeling beside Henry, her perfectly pressed dress pooled neatly around her, her expression soft, almost maternal. Claire's instincts prickled immediately. Emily brushed a strand of hair behind her ear, a gesture that used to signal she was about to ask for something. Claire knew it too well. "So your mom works with computers and hospitals?" Emily asked Henry. Her voice sweet-laced with just the right note of admiration to appeal to a child. Henry nodded proudly, reaching for a strawberry. "She builds stuff that tells the doctors if someone's gonna get sicker. It makes beeping noises and shows colors." Emily's smile twitched, her eyes narrowing with interest. "Wow, that's impressive. Does she show you how it works?" Henry, ever the chatterbox when he was excited, started to explain. "There's this screen where it changes when someone's heart, Henry." Claire's voice cut in firm but calm as she crossed the floor toward them. Emily turned, feigning surprise. "Oh, I was just complimenting him. You've raised such a bright boy, Claire." Claire placed a gentle hand on Henry's shoulder. "He is bright, but he's also 7. And we don't talk about proprietary software with anyone, do we, sweetheart?" Henry looked confused but nodded, sensing the shift in mood. Emily's eyes flickered, her mask faltering for just a second. "Claire, don't be so guarded. I'm his aunt." "No, Emily," Claire replied evenly, her voice barely above a whisper. "You're a stranger who hasn't seen him since he was in diapers. Don't pretend otherwise." Claire turned with Henry in hand, but not before catching the tightening of Emily's jaw and the slight flare in her nostrils. That wasn't innocent curiosity. That was calculated interest. Back at their table, Sam had already noticed the interaction. He greeted them with a quick smile, but his eyes immediately locked on Claire's. She tried to get him talking, he asked quietly. Claire nodded, asked about the tech, the systems, the screens, the colors. Sam's face darkened. "She's not subtle. She doesn't have to be. Not when she thinks we're distracted." Claire glanced toward the group of doctors still gathered near the head table. "It's not just about saving face anymore. They're desperate, and they know we've built something powerful." Sam leaned in, his tone all business now. "We need to shut everything down. No more shared access. Cancel guest logins. Encrypt every server, every backup. Wipe local devices. From tonight." "I already called Meredith on the way here," Claire replied. "She's initiating the data lockdown." Sam exhaled slowly, impressed but not surprised. "Good. We built Medscope out of sleepless nights and burned savings. We're not letting anyone leverage it." Claire nodded, but her gaze drifted back to Emily, who had now rejoined Margaret and Rob. They were smiling for photos, pretending the day was perfect, but Claire could see the cracks forming under the surface. Rob looked stiff, distracted. Margaret's grip on his arm seemed tighter than necessary. "They'll come after it," Claire murmured. "Not just the name, the algorithms, the whole platform. It's the only way to preserve what's left of their reputation. If they can't rewrite the past, they'll try to hijack the future." "Let them try," Sam said with quiet certainty. "They're playing checkers. You built chess." Claire gave a tight smile, but even as her husband reassured her, her pulse still raced. Because it wasn't just about data. It was about Henry. And if they were willing to manipulate a child to charm him and coax confidential information from him, there was no telling how far they'd go. She looked down at her son, who now sat contentedly sipping apple juice, feet swinging under the chair, oblivious to the games of power and control playing out around him. "I won't let them use him," Claire whispered. "Not ever again." And in that moment, something solidified inside her. She wasn't just protecting a company or a legacy. She was protecting her family. One built from truth, not pretense. From love, not leverage. The days that followed the wedding carried a strange kind of quiet. For all the laughter and music that had filled the ballroom, what lingered afterward was silence, the kind that seeps in after a storm passes and people begin to count the damage. Claire returned to her home to her son and her work, expecting that she would shut the door on the entire affair. But truth, once revealed, rarely stays dormant. It began with whispers in the medical community. A colleague mentioned almost casually that a formal inquiry had been opened into the Dawson Clinic's billing practices. Another confirmed that an anonymous packet of records had been delivered to the state board. Within a week, the whispers hardened into reports. And though no one said it aloud, Claire knew who had carried the torch. Rob. The same man who had looked her in the eye at the wedding and realized he had been living in a carefully built lie. He had seen enough to understand what Claire already knew. And unlike her, he had access to the documents that could prove it. The investigation moved swiftly. It turned out the Dawson Clinic's history was riddled with ghost treatments, fabricated follow-ups, and claims filed under names that should never have appeared in the system. Claire's name had been only one of many. The difference was that hers carried the memory of betrayal. For the regulators, however, it was just another line in a ledger of deceit. Richard and Margaret were summoned first. The hearings were closed, but news has a way of slipping through cracks. They were confronted with years of misfiled records, suspicious insurance claims, and patterns too blatant to ignore. By the time their lawyers attempted to spin excuses, the outcome was already certain. Their medical licenses were suspended and before long permanently revoked. The Dawson Clinic, a fixture of the town for decades, shuttered its doors. A note taped to the glass door read, "Closed until further notice," but those who knew understood it would never reopen. Emily's fall was swifter. She had been negotiating partnerships on the strength of her supposed Stanford pedigree and her position as the clinic's future leader. But with the scandal consuming the Dawson name, those deals evaporated overnight. Contracts were terminated, invitations rescinded. The same colleagues who once praised her credentials now avoided her gaze at conferences. Reputation once cracked rarely mends. The cruelest cut, however, came from Rob. On the very night of the wedding, after the guests had gone and the band had packed away their instruments, he confronted Emily privately. The conversation did not last long, though fragments reached Claire later through quiet channels. He had asked her plainly about the contradictions, the records, the lies. She had no answers that could survive the light of scrutiny. By dawn, he was gone, leaving behind both a marriage certificate barely signed and a woman whose carefully constructed life had collapsed in a matter of hours. For Claire, there was no joy in watching this unfold. She had lived long enough to know that vindication does not always bring comfort. Success had already given her distance. What came now was something colder, more final. The family that had cut her out was unraveling not by her hand, but by the weight of their own choices. One afternoon, a letter arrived at her office. The envelope was plain, the handwriting immediately familiar. She turned it over in her hands for several minutes before opening it. Inside was a single sheet written in Emily's careful script. It did not ask for money. It did not beg for a second chance. It was instead an apology, stumbling, uneven, but real. Emily admitted that she had gone along with the family's decision to erase Claire, that she had believed it would protect her own future. She wrote of the envy she had carried since childhood, of the way she had been told again and again that Claire's ambition threatened her own worth. She wrote of how she had hidden behind lies because the truth had always made her feel small. And now, with everything gone, she was left with nothing but regret. "I don't want you to fix this." The letter ended. "I know it can't be fixed. I only hope that one day you might remember me as more than the person who let you down." Claire read the letter once, then again. She folded it carefully and placed it in her desk drawer, not out of forgiveness, but out of recognition. It was not absolution she felt, but something quieter. Finality. The story she had been forced into all those years ago had reached its natural conclusion. No shouting, no vengeance, just silence and the undeniable consequences of choices made. Outside her office window, the city moved on. Patients filled hospitals. Medscope contracts expanded, and life pressed forward. The Dawson name, once so heavy with expectation, now carried only the faint echo of what might have been. And for Claire, that was enough. 6 months passed, not quickly but steadily, as time often does when one has made peace with the past. Claire threw herself into her work at Medscope, into the steady expansion of the company's partnerships, and into the quiet rhythms of her home life with Sam and Henry. The letter from Emily remained in her desk drawer, folded neatly untouched after the day she first read it. She had not answered. She had no words to give, no desire to reopen wounds that had finally begun to heal. But she had not thrown it away either. Some part of her understood that even broken ties leave a shadow, and ignoring it completely would be another kind of lie. Instead of writing back, Claire did something else. A week after the letter arrived, she instructed her assistant to send an internship application to the address on the envelope. Nothing was said. No note attached. No explanation. It was not an olive branch in the traditional sense. It was simply an open door. Emily could choose whether or not to walk through it. Claire would not pull her, and she would not push her away. It was perhaps the only gift she could give without betraying the boundaries she had fought so hard to build. The months rolled on. Medscope grew. More hospitals integrated their system. More conferences invited Claire to speak. More young professionals looked to her as a model of resilience and vision. Henry thrived in school, curious and bright, his questions about the world often echoing in Claire's heart long after he had gone to bed. At night, she sometimes wondered what Emily was doing, whether she had taken the chance offered to her, whether the apology had been more than just ink on paper. But she did not dwell. Life had taught her that the only direction worth facing was forward. It was at a national medical conference in Chicago that the paths of the sisters crossed again. Claire was there to deliver a keynote on the future of predictive patient monitoring, a topic that had become her signature. The hall was crowded, buzzing with conversation and the clatter of name badges against lanyards. Claire walked with her team toward the Medscope booth, where a polished display showcased their latest innovations. And then she saw her. Emily stood near the edge of the education pavilion, not in designer dresses or surrounded by admirers as she once had been, but in a simple navy blue uniform issued to new trainees. She clutched a folder against her chest, the Medscope internship packet clearly visible in her hands. Her hair was tied back plainly, her makeup minimal, her face more drawn than Claire remembered. But her eyes, those same eyes that once darted with calculation, looked different now, clearer, weighted with something closer to humility. Their eyes met across the crowd. For a moment, the noise of the conference seemed to fall away. There were no gasps, no dramatic outbursts, no old arguments spilling back to life. Just two women bound by blood but separated by choices, recognizing each other for who they truly were. Emily did not smile, nor did she cry. She simply held the folder a little tighter, as if it were a lifeline. And Claire, steady as ever, offered nothing but a small nod. Not forgiveness, not reconciliation, just acknowledgement. The silence between them was its own language. Emily's gaze said what her letter had tried to express, that she knew she had lost, that she understood the damage could not be undone, and that she was willing finally to start at the bottom. Claire's eyes answered without words. "You may start, but I will not carry you. You must walk this path yourself." After a moment, Claire turned back to her team. She had a presentation to deliver, contracts to finalize, lives to improve. She did not look back again. She didn't need to. That fleeting connection had said everything. Later, as she stepped onto the stage and the lights brightened overhead, Claire felt no heaviness from the past, no tug of old grief. Instead, she felt the certainty of her own journey. She had built something enduring out of the very emptiness her family once left her with. She had turned exile into legacy. And now she had given Emily the smallest of opportunities, not as a sister, not as a savior, but as a leader who understood that sometimes the most powerful form of forgiveness is simply allowing someone the chance to try. When the applause rose at the end of her keynote, Claire glanced once more toward the edges of the crowd. Emily was still there, seated among other trainees, her folder open, now pen in hand, taking notes. Their paths would cross again, but not as sisters entangled in old resentments. They would cross as individuals sharing the same field on terms Claire had defined. And with that quiet understanding, Claire returned to her work, her head high, her heart unburdened, her silence as eloquent as any words could ever be. The week after Chicago, the clamor of the conference faded into its usual place, one more milestone in a long line of them. Claire returned to the office and asked her controller to schedule time with their attorneys. Not for a merger, not for another hospital contract. Something else. She had been thinking about it quietly for months, sketching it on legal pads in the margins of budgets, leaving herself voicemails during school pickups and red lights. She knew exactly what she wanted and exactly what she didn't. It would not carry the Dawson name. It would not be a gesture toward her parents or a last attempt at rewriting a past that had already told the truth. It would be for the people she once was, for the young and capable who lacked a safety net, and a family willing to bet on them. They filed the paperwork for a new nonprofit and gave it a simple, unadorned title, the First Step Scholarship. Claire endowed it with personal funds and a slice of Medscope's annual profits tied to performance so it would grow with the work that made it possible. The mission statement was short. It promised opportunity for students in health fields who had the talent and drive, but no reliable support system to get them through the years when life is mostly bills and doubt. 20 full awards each year, renewable covering tuition books, housing stipends, and a small emergency fund for when the refrigerator dies or a car needs brakes and the semester can't pause to accommodate it. She refused to make it only about money. Each recipient would be paired with a mentor, a working clinician, administrator, or engineer. Someone to answer the questions that never appear on a syllabus. How to navigate a hostile supervisor. How to negotiate a first offer, when to ask for help. How to keep going when everything in you wants to stop. A Saturday workshop every month would bring the cohort together. No formal networking theater, just people telling the truth about how careers are actually built. In the margins, Claire made notes about a small fund for licensure fees, exam prep courses, and travel grants for first conferences. She called it the Bridge Fund. The name made her smile. She had needed bridges once. She had found them the hard way. The board came together quickly. Sam agreed to serve as chair in the first year, promising to step back once the structure was solid. A retired hospital CEO, a nurse educator from a community college, a social worker who'd built a respected clinic in a forgotten zip code, each said yes without haggling. They knew what it meant to be overlooked. They also knew how to spot real grit. The selection criteria were clear and not easily gamed: academic promise, documented financial and family instability letters that spoke more about character than polish. No photo submissions, no legacy preferences, no naming rights for donors. Claire wanted it clean. By late spring, the inbox filled. Applications arrived from students who studied on their phones in cars after shifts, who slept on couches, but never missed labs, who sent transcripts with coffee stains and apologies for the smudges. Claire read everyone. She marked them not with pity, but with recognition. In the first cohort, there was a daughter of a long-haul trucker who had raised his children alone and then died of a stroke the week before her acceptance letter. A former EMT who had worked nights for 4 years and could recite the sound of a failing monitor in his sleep. A woman in her 30s who was the first in her family to attempt college, now determined to become a PA after watching a neighbor cycle through the ER for conditions that could have been managed upstream. All of them had already shown the thing Claire valued most: they kept moving. On the morning they announced the inaugural class, she chose not to hold a gala. No stage lights. No speeches for donors. Instead, they invited the 20 students to a modest conference room with windows that looked out over the city. There were sandwiches and coffee and a stack of folders at each seat. Claire greeted them one by one. She learned names, faces, the long drives they had taken to get there. When they sat, she stood without a microphone. "I can't promise this will be easy," she said, "but I can promise you won't do it alone. The day will come when you think you've made a mistake, when the bills pile up and someone tells you you're not cut out for this. On that day, call your mentor. Email our office. Use the Bridge Fund. Show up to the Saturday workshop even if you feel ashamed. Especially if you feel ashamed. The difference between the people who make it and the people who don't is rarely talent. It's whether they had one more handhold when the wall got steep. Afterward, a young man lingered at the door, the folder hugged tight to his chest. "I didn't think anyone would ever pick me," he said. Claire smiled. "We didn't pick you," she answered. "You chose yourself a long time ago. We're just catching up." That evening the house was quiet when Henry padded into the kitchen and found his mother rinsing soil from her hands. A tray of seedlings waited on the counter: tomatoes, basil, and a few pepper plants he had picked from the nursery because he liked the names on the tags. In the backyard, the raised beds were dark and ready, the earth loosened and rich. "Can I help?" he asked. "You can do more than help," Claire said, passing him a small trowel. "You can be in charge of spacing." He frowned with the seriousness she loved. "What's spacing?" "It's making sure each plant has enough room to do what it was made to do," she said. "Too close and they choke each other. Too far and the soil goes to waste." They worked side by side, Henry digging careful holes, Claire pressing seedlings into the earth and firming the soil around their fragile stems. The air smelled of cut grass and the faint sweetness of the compost they had turned that morning. When they paused to drink water on the back step, Henry looked up at her with that frank curiosity that sometimes startled her. "Why do you help people you don't know?" he asked. She thought of the applications spread across her dining table of the letters that began, "Dear Committee," because the writers could not imagine a human being on the other end. She thought of a younger version of herself standing in the rain with a suitcase waiting for a door that would not open. "Because no one helped me," she said gently, "and because someone should have. Sometimes you build the thing you needed and give it to the next person." Henry nodded and went back to the beds, making sure each plant sat upright. He pressed the soil with both hands and patted it twice, an invented ritual he insisted made everything grow better. Claire watched him for a long moment. There it was, more tangible than any contract, a legacy that didn't need a family name stamped across it. Not Dawson, not even hers. Just the visible proof that something good could take root where harm once did. When dusk settled, they washed their hands at the hose and put the tools back in the shed. Inside, Sam had set the table and left the kitchen window open so the evening air could drift through. Claire glanced toward her office as they passed. The drawer with Emily's letter was closed. The first step paperwork sat in a neat stack awaiting signatures for the next year's cohort. The work would continue. The garden would, too. She turned off the porch light and followed her son inside, knowing that what endures is rarely loud. It looks like tuition paid on time, a mentor answering the phone at midnight, a seedling set at the right distance so it can breathe. It looks like a boy learning how to care for something small and alive, and a woman who has finally learned to put her name on the things she builds, not to erase the past, but to make sure the future has a place to grow. The city stretched wide beneath the windows of Claire's office, glass and steel reflecting the late afternoon sun. She stood with her hands resting lightly on the back of a chair, watching traffic pulse through the streets below. The hum of the building was steady keyboards, clattering phones, ringing, her team moving forward with the same determination she had built her life upon. On her desk, the screen of her computer blinked with a new message. The subject line bore Emily's name. For a moment, Claire simply stared at it. She knew what it would say. The same words rewritten in new forms, apologies, explanations, fragments of regret. She had read the first letter, and that was enough. The rest did not belong to her anymore. With a quiet movement, she guided the cursor to the trash icon. The email vanished, leaving no trace. She felt no anger, no triumph. Only the recognition that the story had ended long before this message arrived. That chapter was behind her, and no letter could reopen it. Another notification appeared almost immediately. This one carried the subject line of a major hospital network, their logo crisp and unmistakable. She clicked. The message was short but weighty, a proposal to expand Medscope's system into every facility in their region. It was the kind of partnership she had once only dreamed of, now placed squarely in her hands. Work would continue as it always had. progress did not pause for personal history. The office door burst open just then and Henry ran in. His cheeks flushed, his smile wide. He carried a small notebook under one arm, pages of his careful drawings spilling out as he hurried across the room. "Mom," he said breathlessly. "Dad says if we leave now we'll get to the zoo before they close. The tiger cubs came out today. Can we go? Please." Claire turned from the computer, her gaze softening. She reached out and brushed a strand of hair from his forehead. "Yes, sweetheart," she said. "Let's go see the tigers." He grabbed her hand eagerly, tugging her toward the door. She allowed herself to be pulled along, pausing only to switch off the light. Behind her, the email with Emily's name remained deleted, the hospital proposal still open and waiting for her return. Ahead of her, the laughter of her son echoed down the hallway, and the life she had built, firm, resilient, and whole, waited beyond the office walls. As they stepped into the elevator, Claire glanced at their reflection in the mirrored doors herself, her child and the promise of an evening spent in joy rather than memory. And in that quiet moment she knew with certainty what had taken her so long to learn. I don't need anyone to recognize me anymore. I only need to know that I no longer have to run. If you have followed Claire's journey until now, you know this was never just a story about betrayal or revenge. It was about choosing dignity over bitterness, truth over lies, and the kind of quiet strength that lasts longer than applause. Perhaps you have lived through something similar in your own way. Perhaps you have walked into a room where you were not expected, carried the weight of a family's silence, or built something out of nothing but your will to endure. I would love to know what you think. What would you have done in Claire's place? Would you have spoken out, or like her chosen silence as your final answer? Share your thoughts in the comments. Every perspective adds to the conversation, and your voice may be the one someone else needs to hear today. And if this story resonated with you, if you want more tales that blend drama, real emotion, and the reminder that strength can be found even in the darkest corners, then I invite you to subscribe to this channel. Each story we tell is crafted to keep you engaged, to make you think, and perhaps even to help you see your own life in a new light. Subscribe now so you don't miss the next one. Because sometimes the most powerful endings are not shouted but whispered, and the next story may hold the whisper you've been waiting for.